All right, guys, I'm going to start back off with redox reactions. Um, I don't know how many of you had chemistry before or studied chemistry, maybe in high school or whatever, but oxidation reduction, these are reactions that involve the movement of electrons. So if you're oxidized, that means electrons are removed from the atoms, and reduction means you gain electrons. And we kind of collectively call these redox reactions. Uh, there's no way you can have oxidation without reduction. Um, so it involves both. So one um, molecule is going to gain electrons and one's going to lose electrons every time this reaction happens. Now, this is going to be important because this is the way energy is transported through what we call the electron transport chain to make ATP, to make the energy that cells and an organism needs to survive. Right, so that's why it's important, and I'll go over this with you a little more here later on in this lecture and explain how this actually happens. Okay, and of course, every time it takes forever to get a slide to move it. But anyway, while we're waiting on that, give me just a second. And if you've ever bitten into an apple and let it sit out, on a table or whatever, and it turns brown, that's oxidation. If you've ever had a piece of metal rust, that's oxidation. Good, here we go. So what happens with that is through oxidation, we take one compound and we remove an electron from it and give it to another one. And I know it sounds backwards that something is being reduced when it actually gains something, but in a redox reaction, the one that's gaining the electron is reduced, and the one that loses the electron is oxidized. And this happens anytime you have a piece of metal that rusts out in your yard. If you leave a lawnmower or something out and it rains, and all of a sudden you see rust on it, or your car has a scratch in it and there's rust, that's oxidation. Again, the apple is the best example that everybody's probably familiar with. You buy into an apple and you leave it, sitting for a few minutes. It really doesn't take but about 30 minutes and it'll turn brown. It's because those cells are being oxidized. And oxidation is really a health hazard in humans as well. I mean, when we consume foods and things that want to oxidize our cells, we need what we call antioxidants in our system to take that oxygen away so that it doesn't damage our cells. And bacteria and other microorganisms, they need the same thing. They need to be able to neutralize that oxygen so it's not dangerous. I know we have to breathe oxygen every day. It seems like it's our friend, but it really isn't. Oxygen is a highly reactive molecule, and especially in some of the excited states that it gets into. And it can really damage a lot of our cells and a lot of tissues in our body. And it can do the same thing for a bacteria or a protist or any other microorganism. It's our enemy. We've had to figure out a way to live with it ever since photosynthesis started occurring on the planet. You got to remember when Earth first formed, there was no oxygen. It wasn't here. And it was only through those photosynthetic organisms that they started producing oxygen as a waste product. It's almost like their poop that other organisms had to figure out a way to deal with it. And that's what we evolved to do. We evolved to be able to incorporate it into our cellular metabolism so that we can make it less toxic. And bacteria have done the same thing. Your aerobic bacteria that live in the presence of oxygen, they did it first, and they learned how to do it before we did. The anaerobic bacteria never evolved to that level, and they're stuck kind of where they're at. And they can only live in anoxic zones where there's no oxygen around. So again, we look at oxidation reduction basically as a hydrogen atom. We call them dehydrogenations. So the oxidation that occurs within a biological system involves the movement of a hydrogen atom. And if you remember your periodic table and a little bit of chemistry from whenever you took it, um, hydrogen has one proton, has one electron, and zero neutrons. And so we call a hydrogen atom sometimes a proton. And then when it gets moved from one element to another, or one molecule to another, not element, the molecule to another, we call that a dehydrogenation. You can see this in some of your food items. If you'll read the label on this, see a dehydrogenated blah blah blah, and that just means they removed the hydrogen, or they removed the oxidation part of the reaction when you eat that food. So basically, what happens is that a proton, a hydrogen atom, is removed from an organic molecule and then passed on to a carrier molecule. And what I mean by a carrier is that it can hold that electron and then carry it and send it to another guy. So it's kind of like you're passing a letter to a person and they pass it to another and they pass it to another. And this is going to happen down what we call the electron transport chain, where an electron is transported from one molecule to the next, to the next, to the next. And then eventually that energy is used to make something like ATP that the cell needs for energy. So again, ATP is generated by the phosphorylation of ADP. ADP is adenosine diphosphate. When we add another phosphate to that, it becomes ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And that's where we get our energy from. That's where our cells and bacterial cells and any cell that's living, whether it be a bacteria, a plant, or a human, or an animal, whatever, that's where we all get our energy from. And that's the thing we have in common with each other, is that we all use the same energy source. So again, adenosine diphosphate plus energy, and the phosphate group turns into ATP. The more you add, and again, this is a little bit of chemistry going back, but the more bonds you add to this molecule, the more energy it has. So ADP has a lot less energy than ATP. So when we phosphorylate ADP and put a phosphorus on the end of that, we're giving it more energy. And our cells can take that and convert it over to energy that we can use. So again, when high energy phosphates are added to ADP, we generate ATP, which is what we use for energy. You can see the same thing here. So electrons are transferred from one electron carrier to the next, down what we call the electron transport chain. And that is the energy that we're going to use to generate ATP. I don't know how many of you are familiar with how we generate electricity, for instance, in a hydroelectric dam, but we convert water moving through a dam, turning a turbine that has a magnet inside that converts that over into electrical energy, and then we store that energy in a capacitor of some type, and then we can put it on the grid. It's kind of the same thing. We're just shifting energy around. I don't know if you remember, the law of conservation of energy, but energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. And that's what we're doing here. We're just changing forms from the inherent energy in an electron into whatever energy we need from our cells, whether it be a muscle cell for movement, or we need that for, making a gland operate. It doesn't matter. Bacteria do the same thing. They use the same form of energy to carry out their metabolic processes and things they need to survive. If they need to move their flagella, that takes ATP. It requires energy to do that. So just kind of keep that in mind. We're all related. All living things are, we're all working the same way. We all operate the same way. I don't care if it's your dog, a worm, or your cat. It doesn't matter. We're all operating on the same principle of life. And that is that we have to take in energy, break it down, convert it to ATP, and then that ATP is used to do whatever that organism needs to do. So this is what an electron transport chain looks like. Now, again, I don't want you to memorize all of this. I just want you to be able to kind of see what's happening here. We have an oxidation and reduction reaction occurring the whole way down. So the reduction is the red arrow, and the oxidation is the yellow arrow here. And you just notice every one of these carrier molecules, all it does is just boost the electrons until they get down to this point that we can use them to produce ATP. And what I mean by this is that they basically travel down what we call the electron transport chain and just keep transferring energy from one molecule to the next until we get to the right molecule that can actually transfer that energy into making ATP from ADP. And notice that this requires oxygen, and it also gives off water. And we see that in cellular respiration. We see that with in the opposite degree, photosynthesis. And I'll get into that with you in a minute and kind of go over the reaction. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are basically the opposite of one another. One goes one direction, one goes the other. All right? So in this case, we're taking in oxygen and making water, but in the process, we produce ATP. That's why when we breathe out in the wintertime, you see that, some people say blowing smoke, but it's not smoke, it's water vapor coming out of your breath that's condensing in the cold weather. And that's why you see it. It's the result of this reaction. So we'll get into that later, and I'll go in more detail with all the stuff that happens with that. Photophosphorylation, this is where we use light energy to trap energy. And this is what bacteria and some protists and plants do. They can take light energy through sunlight and convert that to ATP, and then they can send that through a transfer of electron transport molecules, and that can become the energy source for the plant. People don't think about plants the same way they do animals. You think of a plant, well, it makes its own food. That's what you've probably been taught since grade school. And there's some truth to that. But when they make their own food, they still have to consume that food. So not only do they make their own food, they eat that food. So they go through photosynthesis and they go through cellular respiration just like we do. The difference between us and plants and other photosynthetic organisms is that we consume something else, and we don't have to go through that step of making our own food. We go out and sequester our own food. We have to eat something. We have to kill something. And, whether it be a plant or an animal, we have to go out and obtain that and eat it. We're not capable of making our own food. Plants, on the other hand, can do both. They can make their own food and consume it at the same time. So while the sunlight's bright during the day, they're out there photosynthesizing and making sugars. But at night, when it's dark, they consume those sugars and they go through respiration just like we do. So don't think of plants as being, this self-sustaining thing. I mean, they eat what they make. The only difference between us and them is that they have the ability to make food and we don't. And we have to go find something and consume it. And bacteria are pretty much the same way. There are a few, that are photosynthetic and they can do their own thing, and chemosynthetic. But most of all, bacteria have to find some kind of energy source to rely on, something else to make their food for them, just like we do. All right, so this is photosynthesis. There's two different ways that plants can carry out photosynthesis. Number one is cyclic, where the electron gets reintroduced to the chlorophyll and ATP is made over and over using the sunlight. So we can see that here. Light hits chlorophyll, it boosts an electron to a higher energy state, and as that electron moves down the electron transport chain. That energy is used to form ATP, and then that electron is returned to chlorophyll, light boosted again, and so on and so on. That's cyclic. The non-cyclic form is where light comes in, boosts an electron from chlorophyll, but instead of going back to the original molecule, it now goes to a different one, and it's excited again, and then it's used, and then NADPH is produced as a byproduct. Notice here that water, though, is required for that to happen. So when we look at plants, this is the vast majority of plants right here. It's this non-cyclic. They have to have that water. That's why if you don't water your garden, your plants die. They need that water in order to get those electrons to boost up, and then those electrons are lost. They're not lost in the sense that they're gone. They just go into a different form, the NADPH from NADP, and then that goes on to the next animal or plant or whatever that eats it, or fungi or whatever else. But these are the two ways that organisms can use sunlight and actually produce energy from it. And all they're doing is taking the sun and reincorporating that energy into a carbohydrate of some form, like a sugar, in order for that plant or bacteria or produce to survive. All right, I'm going to stop here, and I will put another video up tomorrow. I have had a long weekend. I had a family member pass away, and I've been dealing with people calling me almost every hour today. So anyway, I'll try to get this done tomorrow and get this chapter and tell you what you need to know from the next couple. All right.